by 1968 you'd taken silk. Are there particular cases during those years that you recall especially fondly or felt you were particularly successful in?
I thought you might ask me that. Looking back on all my legal work, strangely enough, but both on and off the bench, the case which I found most fascinating was a Papua New Guinea case. In the 10 years or so before Papua New Guinea got independence, which I think was 1972, straight after the Whitlam government took office. But there were a series of cases in Papua New Guinea which were crafted by some clever lawyers, Australian lawyers up there, cases in which groups of Papua New Guineans claimed they owned the land upon which they lived. This is not generally known at all, if at all. One of the barristers, Australian barristers, who crafted these cases was a fellow called Ron Caston. You know Ron?
Certainly do.
Now, I got to know Ron well. He was a terrific fellow.
Died too young.
Oh, much too young. But it was, I'm sure, his work on those cases which led to the Australian Aborigines land rights claims. I'm sure that's right. And I don't think Ron has ever been sufficiently credited with, as I believe he should be, with promoting the ideas which led to Mabo. At any rate, Ron appeared for a group called the Booty Bum people, one of these things stick in your mind, who lived in the area between the Bootabum and the Markham rivers on the northern coast of Papua New Guinea, and where the town of Lae is situated. So Ron appeared for them in a claim against the Papua New Guinea government, which was then controlled, so to speak, from Australia. And so I went up for the government to defend this claim, and where I got to know and like very much Ron Caston and his wife Nellie. I didn't see much of Nellie, but she was a very nice lady. And Ron was probably able to do this sort of work because I think Nellie's family was very rich. You know that, do you? She was a member of the Smorgon family, who were very, very rich. I don't know whether Ron's family were rich, but Nellie's family were multi-millionaires and now are billionaires. But anyway, I appeared against Ron, and the case was legally and factually fascinating. It depended on two real issues. One was a factual issue, whether at the time when the German missionaries, who were the first European people in that part of the world, came in about, as I remember, about 1875, whether at that time the Bootabum people were I think the word was in occupation of the land. And my case was, and I got shot down in flames, factually as I should have been, was that they weren't in occupation. But Ron was able to get evidence like this. He was able to get into the then East German records of letters written by Lutheran missionaries back to Germany, to their head office in the 70s and the 80s, and they would describe conditions. And they would say these letters were tended there, and he somehow got them out of what was then East Germany, a communist country. And the missionaries would write to the head office saying, there's been a big battle down on the river today, and 15 people killed, but the Buthabum people survived. And they dug up these bloody bodies and proved that what the missionaries were saying was correct. There were 15 people buried down on the river, Any rate, that was the one issue, was whether or not, a purely factual issue, who occupied this land when the British came along, not the Australians, the British came along. And the second was a series of related legal questions, was whether or not a company called, I think it was called the German Trading Company of Berlin, came along about 1890 and were given by the Kaiser a sort of a charter to occupy this land, just as in effect the East India Company in England, and perhaps about 1870 were given a charter, perhaps earlier, to go to India. But the charter was in terms which said you can occupy this land, but not if it's occupied by the natives. So if it was occupied by the natives, they were not entitled to it. So having lost, I didn't know at the time, I argued the case, because although I didn't know later after I saw the decision, having lost the occupation point, I then had to argue that because of supervening events, the natives had lost their title. And then when the British came along in 1914, and when they tossed the Germans out of New Guinea, Australia, you may remember, had become the trustee of Papua, which was the southern part. Having tossed the Germans out, the British in effect took their title from the German interests, and then that gave rise to questions of German law as to whether or not Britain recognised German law, and so it went on and on. And I just won this case by the skin of my teeth before very good judges, Kelly, and the other side appealed to the full court of Papua New Guinea, which then came in, and I just hung on to the case by the skin of my teeth. And in those days, the High Court of Australia was the ultimate court, and the natives appealed, and Ron Caston ran the case to the High Court, or sought leave to appeal. And I've never had a more hopeless case in the High Court, because Barwick was on top and the other judges, and they were busting to decide this case. So they granted them leave to appeal. And the appeal's pending when Whitlam takes power, and he grants the government of Papua New Guinea independence. And then Samari comes into the scene, and he settles the case on purely and very proper political grounds. And so the appeal never went on in the High Court, but it was an absolutely fascinating case. Of all the cases I did as a barrister, none had the extraordinary factual issues of that case, or the extraordinary legal question. I had to get on top of German law and so on.